The decision made in 5 minutes that lasted a decade. It took less time than a coffee break. No deep analysis. No extended debate. Just a quick agreement. In a meeting already running late. And yet, that 5-minute decision would quietly shape the next 10 years of the company's life. At the time, it didn't feel important. Leadership was juggling bigger priorities. Growth targets, market expansion, operational pressure. The decision was framed as a temporary fix, a short-term adjustment meant to keep things moving. Something that could always be revisited later. Except later never came. To understand why this moment still matters today, we need to return to a period when the company was moving fast and thinking short. Competition was intensifying. Opportunities appeared and vanished quickly. Leaders prized decisiveness. Hesitation felt dangerous. In that environment, speed became a virtue and reflection a luxury. The decision itself was simple. Choose option A instead of option B. Not because it was clearly better, but because it was familiar. It fit existing systems. It avoided disruption. It promised continuity at a moment when continuity felt comforting. Someone asked whether the choice might limit future flexibility. The question was acknowledged, then waved aside. This wasn't permanent. It was just for now. What no one considered was how quickly for now becomes, this is how we do things. Our story begins in that meeting room, where alignment came easily because disagreement felt inconvenient. The choice solved an immediate problem. It reduced friction. It allowed teams to move forward without rethinking deeper assumptions. Everyone left relieved, unaware that relief can be one of the most expensive emotions in business. In the weeks that followed, the decision faded from memory, but its effects didn't. Systems were built around it. Processes adjusted to support it. New hires were trained inside its logic. What started as a shortcut became infrastructure. And infrastructure, once in place, resists change. Years later, when the company began struggling with issues that seemed unrelated, slow innovation, rigid workflows, missed opportunities, the root cause felt elusive. The problems appeared complex, structural, cultural. No one thought to trace them back to a 5-minute choice made long ago. But that decision was still there, quietly shaping behavior, quietly narrowing options, quietly defining what the company believed was possible. And once a belief like that takes hold, it doesn't fade easily. The effects of the decision unfolded gradually, so gradually that no single moment felt responsible. Teams adapted to the new constraint without complaint. Workflows adjusted. Tools were selected to match the choice that had been made. What began as accommodation slowly hardened into assumption. This is how things work now. This is how they would always work. New projects inherited the decision without ever questioning it. Plans were designed around its limits. Ideas that didn't fit were reshaped or quietly abandoned, not because they were bad, but because they required undoing something no one remembered choosing. The decision became invisible, embedded so deeply it stopped feeling like a decision at all. Managers noticed friction, but they labeled it operational. Engineers encountered limitations, but they worked around them. Product teams felt boxed in, but assumed the box was permanent. Every workaround reinforced the same belief. Flexibility was expensive, change was risky, and revisiting old choices was unnecessary overhead. Leadership remained unaware. From their vantage point, execution looked fine. Results were acceptable. Nothing was broken enough to justify reopening the past. When challenges surfaced, they were treated as isolated issues rather than symptoms of a shared constraint. The original decision never appeared on any agenda because it no longer had a name. Years passed, then the market shifted. Competitors began moving faster. They launched features that required agility the companies struggled to match. Customers asked for capabilities that clashed with the inherited structure. Each request triggered complex discussions, delays, and compromises. What rivals delivered in weeks took months. What others adapted easily required redesign. Inside the company, frustration grew. Teams pushed harder. Deadlines slipped. Complexity increased. Leadership responded by adding process, oversight, and controls, trying to manage the strain without addressing its source. The 5-minute decision had matured into a decade-long constraint. The conflict sharpened when a major opportunity appeared, one that required rapid adaptation. On paper, it was perfect, strategically aligned, commercially sound, but executing it exposed the truth. The company couldn't move without unraveling years of accumulated dependencies. What once seemed like a small shortcut now defined the company's limits. Only then did someone ask the question no one had asked in years. Why do we do it this way? The room fell quiet. No one had a clear answer. And in that silence, the cost of the decision finally came into focus. The question lingered longer than anyone expected. Why do we do it this way? It echoed through follow-up meetings, planning sessions, and hallway conversations. The deeper team searched for an answer, the more unsettling the truth became. There was no strategic rationale, no documented trade-off, no careful evaluation that justified the constraints shaping so much of their work. There was only memory, vague, incomplete, and inconsistent. One senior manager recalled the decision as temporary. Another remembered it as a compromise made under pressure. A third insisted it had been necessary at the time. None could explain why it had never been revisited. The realization landed quietly but heavily. The company had been living inside an old decision without ever re-choosing it. As teams traced the impact outward, the scope of the damage became clear. Entire systems had been built to accommodate the choice. Hiring profiles favored people who could operate within its limits. Processes evolved to avoid triggering its weaknesses. Even strategy had been around it, shrinking ambition to fit what the structure could support. The company hadn't just adapted to the decision, it had internalized it. The conflict intensified when a cross-functional group modeled what change would require. Undoing the decision meant revisiting architecture, retraining teams, rewriting processes, and absorbing short-term disruption. It would be expensive, risky, uncomfortable. Some leaders argued the cost was too high. The company had survived this long, they said. Why reopen old wounds now? But others saw the situation differently. They argued that the cost wasn't in changing, it was in staying. Every delay, every missed opportunity, every workaround carried a hidden tax. The 5-minute decision was no longer neutral. It was actively shaping what the company could and could not become. Tension peaked during a leadership workshop meant to assess long-term strategy. As scenarios were discussed, the same limitations surfaced again and again, quietly disqualifying options before they were fully explored. That's when the pattern became undeniable. The future wasn't constrained by the market. It was constrained by the past. The group reached an uncomfortable consensus. The company didn't have a performance problem. It had a legacy decision problem. One that had never been re-examined because it felt easier to manage around it than to confront it directly. The moment marked a turning point, not because a solution had been chosen, but because the illusion had broken. The belief that the company was operating freely collapsed under the weight of evidence. The final question was no longer why the decision had been made. It was whether the company had the courage to unmake it. The decision to confront the past did not come easily. It arrived after weeks of uncomfortable analysis, tense discussions, and a growing recognition that avoiding the issue was no longer neutral. The 5-minute choice that once felt harmless had matured into a structural boundary, and boundaries, once invisible, are the hardest to cross. The climax came when leadership reviewed a final comparison. 2 futures, one where the company kept managing around a constraint, adding layers, accepting slower progress, limiting ambition to match what was already built, and another where the company absorbed short-term pain to reclaim long-term freedom. The contrast was stark. One path preserved comfort, the other preserved relevance. There was no dramatic vote, no unanimous moment of clarity, just a sober understanding that the decision had already been made once, and that not choosing now was still a choice. The company could either remain loyal to a 5-minute agreement from a decade ago, or take responsibility for shaping the next 10 years intentionally. They chose to act. The reversal wasn't clean. Systems were refactored. Processes broke before they improved. Teams struggled as old shortcuts disappeared. Productivity dipped. Frustration surfaced. But beneath the disruption was something the company hadn't felt in years. Possibility. Options that had been quietly dismissed were reconsidered. Ideas that once felt impractical resurfaced with new life. The organization began rediscovering its ability to adapt. Months later, the change became visible. Decision cycles shortened, not because things were simpler, but because they were clearer. Teams no longer designed around inherited constraints. They designed around outcomes. Innovation didn't spike overnight, but it stopped fighting gravity. The company wasn't faster because it worked harder. It was faster because it had removed an invisible weight. Looking back, leadership saw the irony. The most expensive decision in the company's history hadn't involved money, risk, or strategy. It involved speed, a moment chosen for convenience that quietly shaped a decade of behavior. The lesson was humbling and precise. Short decisions cast long shadows, and the danger isn't making them. It's forgetting to ever question them again. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The decision